Well, today we've got a great speaker, so I'll ask Sue Lees from Melbourne on Yarra to introduce Dr. Diane Kraal. I gather that you're going to be interviewing her, so that sounds like fun. Over to you, Sue.
Okay, thanks, Carol. Some of the apologies are also for some of these people here at the bush cushion stuffing, who the target is 200 this afternoon, so they're kind of up there doing that, and I'm here. So Diane spoke to Zonta Says Now in October 2022. So some of you might remember that Diane spoke about her research into how taxation could be used to support an uptake in electric vehicles, particularly car fleets, and also about her attendance at COPs over the years. And today we're very fortunate to welcome back Diane, Dr. Diane Kraal, who is now going to talk to us about one of her later ventures, which is actually built on from what she talked about to us originally. So today Diane's going to talk about the book she has co-authored, A Just Transition to Decarbonisation, and it's part of the Just Transitions. Oops, it does help if I hold it up the right way.
Nice.
The Just Transition series, published by Palgrave Macmillan, and available, I had a look through Amazon and Booktopia, which are pretty popular, and I think probably some other sources as well. Very easy to read. An academic work, but very easy to read. So Diane's chapter in the book is about transport. The other chapters are based on the COP themes of loss and damage, transport, nature and youth, and basically delves into climate, energy, environmental and humanitarian justice. So the co-authors of this book are members of Monash University, but the book has actually come from Diane's work as a member of the Energy Justice and Social Contract Project at the University of Pau and des Pays de l'Adour in France, and has meant that Diane and I are both learning U3A French together. So the book is very important for us to learn about as well, because it clearly discusses the importance of climate change being treated as a humanitarian issue and also an economic, political, social, legal considerations. So we can use the information from this book basically to help us also in our quest to make the argument about gender justice in terms of climate change. So it's really important for us, I think, to understand this book, and because it's a very well-authored academic work, I think it's high on our list of considerations. So we're going to actually have an interview. I'm going to interview Diane about the book so that hopefully you'll get an idea of the book itself and the main themes and issues within the book. So let's start, Diane, with, as the co-author, why did you do this? Why did you undertake this endeavour, and what's the goal of the book?
Okay, thanks very much, Sue and everyone, and it's great to be here to talk about the co-authored book. The goal of our book is to explore the urgent need for a just transition to achieve the goal of decarbonisation. And our chapter themes have been drawn from recently held United Nations climate change conferences. And the book's themes are loss and damage, transport, nature and youth. Now, we could have certainly included gender, but the book's themes reflect the expertise of the various authors. But certainly the impact on gender issues could well have been, a chapter in this book. But nonetheless, the book has sought to capture the justice process as societies move towards a decarbonised economy, and our book delves into climate action through climate justice, energy justice, and environmental justice.
Okay, so can you can you explain what a just transition actually means, like and its different meanings and why that's important?
Sure. Okay. So a just transition has been defined as transitioning away from fossil fuels towards a more just future to alleviate past social inequalities. So whether it be, in areas of transport or gendered type issues. It is acknowledged that there are mixed meanings of a just transition for scholars of climate justice, environmental justice, and energy justice. A just transition to achieve decarbonisation covers all these different perspectives. So therefore, climate justice is about sharing the benefits and burdens of climate change from a human rights perspective, whereas environmental justice aims to treat citizens equally, whether they be male or female or dispossessed peoples, equally in the development of policies and laws. And by contrast, energy justice, which is my specific area, concerns the application of human rights across the entire energy life cycle. For instance, it has got a large body of theory that covers 5 justice principles: distributive, recognition, procedural, cosmopolitan, and restorative.
So with the COP process, there was a just transition work program at COP28 in Dubai. What does that mean?
Okay, so the Just Transition Work Program is actually not covered by our book, but it's very topical, so I'll just touch on it a little bit. So the program aims to facilitate countries' just transitions to low emissions and a climate resilient future through actions that also contribute to reducing inequalities within and between countries. The Just Transition Work Program is set to encourage conversations between countries and other stakeholders, such as policymakers, non-government organisations such as Zonta, and local communities to devise more effective ways of realising just transitions in the socio-economic and environmental sphere. And it's got 5 principles. First of all, it must first and foremost champion a people-centred approach. It must address global inequality and reject oppressive global systems. It needs unconditional support from developed countries, such as the US, Australia, the UK, etc. It must create comprehensive and flexible just transition pathways. And finally, the Just Transition Work Program must build synergies with other global climate-related activities.
Wow, a big task. So in terms of that Just Transition Work Program, let's unpack the issue of loss and damage, which is a chapter in the book. How significant was progress on this at COP27 and 28? We know that there's a few problems there. Where is it significant, and what's missing and what needs to happen next in terms of loss and damage?
Okay, thanks, Sue. So as part of our book's chapter 2, Climate Justice and Concept of Loss and Damage in Climate Negotiations, what was covered was the agreement to a loss and damage fund at the UN Climate Change Conference in Egypt in 2022, which was COP27. It was an important moment in the global climate justice movement. Loss and damage formally addresses the fundamental injustice underlying climate negotiations, which is that countries least responsible for carbon emissions are bearing the heaviest burdens from climate change and have not, until now, received adequate assistance from those most responsible, in other words, developed countries. So the UN Climate Change Conference in Dubai in 2023 saw the establishment of a loss and damage fund through startup pledges from various nations, but the financial pledges were far too low. To properly address the real cost of loss and damage suffered by developing countries, there needs to be between $100 and $580 billion pledged.
You're certainly covering some whopping issues.
Mm.
So chapter 3 was your chapter about transport. You looked at Australia, but you're also asking the wider questions that relate to international experience from the Australian experience. What are those wider questions? What are they in terms of subsidy? And what does all this mean to the ordinary consumer?
Okay, so just bearing in mind, our book is holistic. It's not, we all work together through the various chapters with the introduction and also the conclusion. But in any case, chapter 3, zero emissions transport, taxation support for business electric cars, was where we sought to address the need for lower carbon emissions from cars. So transport in Australia is responsible to the extent of 20% of carbon emissions here. The EU is not far off. Their figure is 25%. And for instance, the UK is 26% in terms of transport emissions. So in July 2022, Australia removed its fringe benefits tax from company-provided electric vehicles. This came after intense lobbying to the government for tax-free EVs in order to boost their uptake. Unfortunately, the tax-free policy also applies to business petrol-fueled SUVs. Now, many have argued there should not be a tax break for, these petrol cars. However, politicians see tradespeople with SUVs as an important constituency and did not remove the tax break from their petrol cars. Anyway, as a result of the July 2022 legislation, some revenue from fringe benefits tax will be lost to government, but this is balanced by the fact that older electric vehicle fleet cars can eventually be sold to the public as second-hand vehicles and help, again, boost that uptake. The car debate raging at the moment in Australia concerns vehicle emission standards, and some of you may, have seen references in the press. The UK and EU have strict emission standards, but the emission rules in place in Australia today date back to 2009, which have been superseded in Europe a decade ago. Emission standard Euro 6D will be introduced in Australia in 2025, and car makers are still arguing the point that if emission standards are introduced in Australia, it will affect the importing of cars to Australia, and there will be other cost risks. So there is still a scare campaign going on. We're still miles behind and we need to do more.
So let's turn to the nature chapters. So again, mentioning that you looked through the Australian lens and looking at the wider relevance, and this time it's about First Nations knowledge, and that is actually particularly interesting for us because we've recently had a speaker, Zonta says now, who was a First Nations woman. So can you talk about things like offsetting nature-based solutions in relation to First Nations context,
Sure.
First Nations rights?
No problem. So as per our book chapter 4, Water is Life, Recognising First Nations in Sustainable Water Management and Use, we begin with the Water Act, which is a federal act which recognises the important role of Indigenous people in water management and use by providing a mandated Indigenous position on the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, which is responsible for the Murray-Darling water system that runs through 4 states and territories in Australia. So the Federal Water Act provides for integrated management of basin water resources. By contrast, the states' legislations vary. There is no uniformity in respect to First Nations people's sustainable water management and use. So, for example, in my state in Victoria, First Nations peoples have the right to take and use water if they have an agreement under the Traditional Owner Settlement Act. Further, Victoria released its First Nations water policy in 2022 called Water is Life, Traditional Owner Access to Water. And the policy roadmap has 2 sections. So first of all, Section A contains the Victorian government policy position, and section B consists of water policy statements made by First Nations peoples. And in particular, section B is important because it contains the vision for First Nations peoples on water justice. So in all, chapter 4 recounts how the ineffectiveness of Australia's cultural heritage protection legislation was exposed when in May 2020, Rio Tinto destroyed the Juukan Gorge in WA, a significant site dating back more than 46,000 years. And the destruction of the Juukan Gorge precipitated a parliamentary inquiry. And I don't need to go any further into that. Most of us have followed that issue. So more needs to be done. That's the point.
So next, let's talk about the chapter on the issue of how free trade agreements can be utilised in terms of climate action. Do developments like the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which has the great title of CBAM,
okay.
Goes against the grain of equity and justice.
Okay. CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is about the EU acting to stop cheap imports of high carbon emission goods and products from companies in non-EU countries by charging those companies with a tariff. So high carbon emission goods include iron, steel, cement, fertilizers, aluminium, fossil fuel activity, hydrogen, and some chemicals. It hardly affects Australia at all because we sell raw materials like iron ore and gas. So it doesn't really affect us much. So the question is, does CBAM or CBAM go against the grain of equity and justice? And I think not. CBAM will make non-EU carbon-intensive products less attractive compared to EU-made greener products. And there are still jobs in making green products from renewable energy. So as per our book, Chapter 5, Utilising Free Trade Agreements to Protect Nature and Heritage, it embodies a different approach to CBAM. The chapter proposes using free trade agreements to address the implications of extracting and trading in fossil fuels such as coal. Coal has a huge negative impact on climate change and biodiversity. In the Australian context, our book recounts the harm done to the Great Barrier Reef in terms of coral bleaching as a result of CO2 emissions from the burning of coal. The chapter covers the inclusion of non-trade provisions to address these biodiversity issues. And our chapter covers the mounting pressure on the ever-increasing number of free trade agreements concluded by states on a bilateral and multilateral basis.
So another chapter is on youth empowerment. Why is this important? I think that's very close to home for a lot of us.
Okay, so our final chapter on youth empowerment. So this was chapter 6. It was entitled Youth Empowerment for a Just Transition. And it's all about us seeing youth as potentially powerful advocates for climate justice and the key to unlocking a just transition to a low carbon economy. However, they must be empowered as custodians of the future. So youth will be empowered through education, training, and public participation, foundational to achieving climate action. It is important to hold governments to account both now and into the future in terms of giving a voice to youth. Today's youth will take their place as the next generation of leaders, managers, decision makers, and voters. And as mentioned in our chapter, the program Action for Climate Empowerment, or ACE, is a crucial component program of the Paris Agreement, and it must be addressed by all UN member countries. So ACE, Action for Climate Empowerment, offers vital avenues for empowering youth in the pursuit of climate justice. And coming times will reveal whether ACE can secure the necessary funding and coordination within a reasonable time frame.
So important. So let's bring this conversation home by talking about your conclusions. What are your thoughts for the future, such as how strategies can be employed at different levels, battles still to be fought, and how justice is really inseparable from wider climate goals?
Okay, so I'll just run through a chapter by chapter basis very briefly, what they were about and the future. So chapter 2 was all about arguing for the creation of a loss and damage fund with the purpose of providing support and assistance to vulnerable countries. And it demonstrates a first move towards recognising climate justice. For the future, even though in 2023 in Dubai, there was a call for a loss and development fund, and there, it was a step towards justice. It is a very small step. It remains unclear at this juncture how the loss and damage fund will be effectively implemented and administered, particularly in the absence of an agreed definition of what loss and damage is. Chapter 3 on transport argues about more taxation support in Australia is necessary to achieve zero emissions transport with a focus on zero emission cars in business fleets. Now, for the future, the Australian government's National Electric Vehicle Strategy 2023 is designed to increase the uptake of EVs and introduce emission standards. This strategy will be a test of whether new policy will result and lead to effective legislation. Chapter 4 on the nature theme argues that First Nations peoples' water knowledge be recognised in Australia's water law and policy for a just transition to decarbonisation. In terms of the future, recognition of First Nations peoples' water knowledge is still a very small and fragile step, as a shift in policy has not yet been translated into meaningful legislative reform, thus making knowledge vulnerable to changing political priorities. Chapter 5 on the theme of nature questions whether free trade agreements could or should be utilised in redressing the harm inflicted by climate change upon the natural environment. And for the future, we see that free trade agreements have a potential to play an important role in a just transition, but this transition cannot be seen as just without adequate place and recognition being given to First Nations peoples. And finally, chapter 6 centred on empowering youth and how it is supported through the Paris Agreement's ACE, or Action for Climate Empowerment program. So for the future, the effectiveness of the youth voice depends on the ability of member parties of the UN to get finance and monitor ACE through their own national action plans.
So thank you, Diane. What an amazing area to be involved in, and we really thank you for giving your expertise. But now I'll open it to questions and I think comments, because I think people might have a number of comments. Like Carol, I know that you put in your submission into the idea of legislation of children, the government being responsible for
Duty of care bill, yeah.
People, yeah, duty of care.
Yeah. No, thanks, Diane. I mean, I like the multi-pronged approach of the book, because it obviously shows that, anything to address the situation with climate there's no silver bullet. It's got to be a holistic approach. A couple of things I wanted to ask was, when you were doing the fringe benefit tax for tax-free EVs and the petrol vehicles were included as well, was there consideration of doing a two-tier approach? So as you would have, say, a bigger tax benefit for EVs and a smaller one for petrol vehicles?
Well, one thing with taxation, you always try and aim for simplicity. And in my submission to the government, and I even spoke before the Senate inquiry on this piece of legislation, I and other like-minded people advocated for the removal of any tax benefit for business SUV petrol cars. But the tradespeople lobby, or the tradespeople as a group, in the various electorates out there, is very powerful, very strong, and there was no change, unfortunately.
Worth a go. Worth a
Yeah,
go.
worth a go. Worth a go.
And when Sue mentioned earlier on that we had an Aboriginal woman speak to us last week, it was actually Professor Anne Polina, and I know that she is actually on the advisory group for the Murray River Basin as well. So I was really interested when you were talking about the Water Act and bringing in the voices of First Nations people into the sustainable water management and use, and that was a new one to me. So I thought that was really interesting. So how can their voices be strengthened? Do we just need to all advocate to members of Parliament? What can we do in that area? Any ideas?
Okay, now it was interesting. I was at the COP in Egypt when there was talk of the fraught nature of the management of the Murray-Darling system. And there's fights from the headwaters of the system right down to South Australia about water usage, water allocation, water wastage, what the sorts of things that water is applied to, the growing of cotton and rice. And so the politicians seem so caught up in their own electorates and very, very powerful concerns on the Murray-Darling Basin that the Indigenous voice is hardly heard. And there was an Indigenous spokesperson at the Australian Pavilion for the COP in Egypt, and he said they need more support for an Indigenous voice with regard to the Murray-Darling Basin. So there's already these pretty intense fights going on. You keep reading about it in the papers, it keeps popping up, and Indigenous voices need to be heard, and they need support. Unfortunately, the referendum was lost for an Indigenous voice to Parliament, so it seems to be like backpedaling for a while, but certainly the traditional management of the Murray-Darling Basin needs to be considered.
Right, okay. I don't want to hog the floor. Does anybody else want a question?
Yep.
Vicky.
Thank you. Thank you, Diane. That's fascinating. I'm not sure, and correct me if I'm wrong, but was there any approach on with climate action incorporating slow and cool burns of vegetation in regards to trying to reduce the wildfire possibility, with increased temperatures? Did that come across your brief at all?
No, because I guess the themes we selected, like there's quite a range of themes in the COP, and we just decided to choose themes based on our expertise. But I know what you're referring to, but no, we didn't cover it in the book.
So Christine and then Janice.
So thanks, Sue. Thanks, Diane, for your presentation. I'm itching to read the book now. Look, I was going to, I'll say two things. One quickly on water. Listening to you, I thought, well, the Water Act, the Federal Water Act came about because the states all agreed to concede power authority to the Commonwealth to enact that legislation. So I'm thinking, why can't we have a similar process where the states come together with First Nations representatives and agree to sorry, I'm getting echo here. I'll keep going. And agree in terms of First Nations, protecting First Nations cultural heritage in their state legislation, or agree to concede power to the Commonwealth to do that. That's the first point. And secondly, I had a question about free trade agreements being used to protect nature. Is there any progress on that globally?
Okay, so first, with regard to water, I mean, currently, with the Murray-Darling Basin, it crosses Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia. Look, it's a really fraught area, and in terms of getting an Indigenous voice, that's what we tried to do, but it was defeated. So
Can I ask everyone
this,
to put their microphones on mute, and we'll see if we can get rid of the thing, apart from the speaker, obviously.
yes. So in terms of Indigenous voices, I think we're backpedaling for a little while on that issue, and hopefully Indigenous peoples will be able to regroup and cover some of these really important areas. In terms of using the free trade agreement provisions for climate action, again, that is a proposal. One author in particular has written quite extensively on the use of free trade agreements to protect heritage. And so I guess it's just a matter of getting momentum with that idea. But like Kabam, it's just another way of addressing what is a global problem.
Janice?
Hi, thanks very much, Diane. That was really great. Very, very interesting. Before you go, can you remind us of the title of your book? But that's not really my question. You may recall that recently Greg Combet, who is the chair of the Net Zero Economy Agency, gave a speech at the National Press Club in which he talked about the need to ensure that, for example, coal mine workers are supported in making what is effectively a just transition. And I think that's quite important, because it actually, if that's successful, it can provide the sort of political background to supporting other aspects of just transition that might seem onerous to the general public. I'd be interested in your comments.
Well, certainly a just transition covers situations where people in fossil fuel industries, such as the coal industry, have to transition out of that industry into renewable energy. And certainly in many parts of Australia, the push for more and more renewable energy is well underway. We see the solar panels, we see the wind turbines. I'm not a great believer in hydrogen, but apart from that, there are justice issues in making that transition. And that's what a just transition is all about, is there's got to be justice in moving from one mode to another to bring about a decarbonised future. And particularly for developing countries, funding is required in order for them to make that transition. Now, Australia's a first world country. We are a developed country, and certainly, the plight of the people in the coal industry is under discussion. But I guess the same thing has happened with the timber industry. Certainly in Victoria, there's no more native timber logging, and people in that industry have had to transition out, but in a just way. So it's a theme that's repeated. I know when I was in the at the COP in Poland just before COVID, I think it was 2020. There was talk about the coal miners in Poland, and there is, there are a lot of areas in Poland where coal is mined, and they have the huge problem of transitioning these workers into different industries and thinking about, what energy are we going to use apart from coal. At least in Australia, we've got the option of solar and wind.
Bridget?
Thank you, Diane, for that. It's probably a comment more than anything else. The council that I work for is at the bottom end of the Murray-Darling Basin in the Coorong. So we see all of what's going on above us, so to speak. My understanding is that in terms of cultural water, we're a long way from any sort of agreement across the states, and even in just the use of the water, with the review due in another couple of years, the states agreeing on how and where and who gets to have the water and the sale of it, is a long, long journey yet. Would you agree?
Oh yes. I actually wrote a co-authored tax paper not so long ago on advocating the taxation of water as a different way to approach this very thorny problem of over-allocation, overuse, metering problems, all sorts of things. And we just we thought, look, because I'm a tax person, we thought, let's just take a fresh look at this problem and just put in a different perspective. But it is a very, very fraught area, and it's a very precious resource, and that's why we're fighting over it. So water and energy are essential to how developed and developing countries. They're basic requirements for a better future, but certainly with South Australia, with the Coorong area, you are at the very end of all this fighting that's going on. It's nasty.
I would love it if you'd share that link to your paper regarding taxation. Thank you.
Yes.
Us again, and then Susan.
Good afternoon. I'm not sure if this is working sound-wise, but my question is about the current support for developing nations being touted for decarbonising transport in developing areas in our region. Diane, I wondered if you could speak to that matter, as there are significant conflicts coming our way through the media, and I wonder how we can progress decarbonisation of transport in places like Papua New Guinea and places where, it's all dependent on infrastructure like wind turbines or solar energy development, and the basic structures for decarbonised transport just aren't there.
Yeah, actually, Papua New Guinea is quite a unique case. I have been to Papua New Guinea 2 or 3 times, looking at the gas industry there. But certainly those with the greatest share of petrol-driven transport are those that can afford it. They're the big companies, executives, etc. And it is not as if Papua New Guinea could not use wind turbines or solar energy to solve its transport problems. But I think they've got more fundamental problems apart from transport. So that is a very tricky question on the list of matters that the government there needs to address.
It is.
And someone else asked before that the name of the book. I don't know. There it is there. And I guess Carol and Sue will put it on the website, but there's the name of the book there, and it's available.
You can also get it online, can't you?
Yeah.
So
I
we'll
have a
put that
picture
in.
of it on screen when I share the screen.
Okay.
I think we've just lost Janice, who was going to ask. Oh, there you are. Did you want to ask?
I'd asked my question. I'd forgotten to take my hand down. That was all. It's down now.
Is there anybody else who'd like to make any comments or ask a question? Carol?
Just one last thing. You were talking about this, the ACE program for youth empowerment. The action. Can you tell us a little bit more about that one?
Well, basically, it's a UN-sponsored program. At the various COPs, they've been trying to get youth there into the foreground. So you've got Greta Thunberg as kind of the youth kind of leader, which is really, really important. And with say the last conference in Dubai, it was very, very hard for youth to be heard because it was expensive to go to the COP in Dubai because of accommodation. And that actually, you know, on an equity basis, it was not good. So the UN people are trying to give them a greater voice, but there are all these, you know, barriers. And this year the COP is at Azerbaijan, so I don't think, you know, that will be a big COP, and I don't think that'll be a COP a lot of youth will be going to. Yeah. But at least they're making an effort to recognise and support, and it needs funding from the various members of the COP countries.
The other day I was reading an article, and a young person was complaining about about youth washing, how they were bringing young people to places like the COP, parading them for photographs, and then they were just ignored. And so I thought that was just an interesting concept, and I'm hoping that the ACE program will help to obviate that trend.
Yeah, look, most definitely. And yeah, the youth are our future. You know, I'm in education. A lot of people here are in education, and they are the future. We need to give them a platform. And there was something in the paper just today and yesterday about university councils and staff and youth voices not being heard because they've got all these professional people from industry who know all about budgeting, etc. And someone was saying, well, that's the way it should be. And then someone else wrote in saying, well, no, there needs to be a youth voice. And I'm fully supportive of, you know, youth having a voice at as early an age as possible.
All right, I'll close. Thank you, Diane. It's been fantastic this afternoon. I think we've learned a huge amount, and it's interesting how actually our speakers are building on each other, because we've got Anne, First Nations. Next time we've got Alana Mountain, who's about how the fight for the forestry industry in Victoria to be closed down, and then in August we have actually got a education program about climate change in America for schools. Yeah, look, we really value your contribution and the thinking that is going on with all this. Like, yet again, we see you and other women who are contributing so much to the problems of the world at the moment in trying to find solutions. So we really thank you for all that work. And we look forward to your next project and getting you back to whatever that is.
Yeah, no, look, thank you very much. It's been great to participate today. And I might just throw something out there. In my bike riding group a couple of weeks ago, we had a big debate about Taylor Swift and her lyrics. And that might be worth getting in someone youthful to talk about the value of that new voice in music and some of the feminist messages in her lyrics.
Oh, that's food for thought.
Yeah.
Have to listen to
do our homework now.
Yes, exactly.